Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to discuss half and full marathon training, at least at an introductory level. Lots of factors. We'll highlight as much as we can. My name is Joshua Grubb. I'm the coach at Arc Running. Also present is our physical therapist, Eric Laterhouse. He will also be providing his knowledge on the subject. Going to touch upon some things that are definitely review, especially if you've seen any of our talks before on training, but highlighting running form is really important. Then I'll talk about within that training, endurance and speed, how they play a role even in half marathon and marathon training. Some additional factors, some touch points as we think about race week and race day. And then Eric will be talking about how to avoid overuse injuries, which is key. Talking about form, and one of the first things I look at as a coach is important because it's not only about injury prevention, which is a major factor. We get injured, we lose all momentum, and we can't get to the starting line. But also, it helps sharpen our economy, our endurance, like our efficiency biomechanically, and thereby speed. And the thing about half marathons and full marathons is Eric and I have seen often is that they expose any vulnerabilities we may have with our running form or our biomechanics. This is a good time of year as people are starting to think about their race schedule this year and maybe just starting to get into a training plan or base training earlier, better to address running form, to start setting up good habits and strength as we build into the mileage. Usually people don't see as many issues unless they have a history of injury. In the early side of training, it's usually mid to the last 8 to 6 weeks of training when it's then very urgent and you definitely can't afford to be dealing with injury issues because the race is coming. You've invested a lot of money potentially in flights, hotels, the race itself. And so the earlier these things are addressed, hopefully setting up for success and not having such a major setback. So just as an overview, thinking about our running form, it's a lot of it's about balance and symmetry. Posture, we're looking at just to not only maximize everything that's happening from our head down to our toes, but also just keeping airways open. Our arm motion basically is our steering wheel. And so how our arms are moving affects a lot of that efficiency of energy output and rhythm. Braking force is something you use to talk about foot strike. That's often the root of a lot of injury issues is the foot strike either being too hard on the heel or midfoot due to overstriding. And then it just works up the kinetic chain, affecting other weak areas potentially. So keeping that brake force, thinking about where's my center of gravity and building off that is essential as we look at running form. They all interact and work together. Cadence, again, arm motion kind of influences our cadence. And then just looking at pelvic stability and drop, we want to just all our motion and energy going forward, not side to side through all its various reasons. And we provide a lot of resources to start thinking about this that are free. You can look at our YouTube channel for some of those instructional videos or look at our website. We also provide virtual, or if you're in the area, on-site running form analysis to really get specific because there's only so much you can self-assess without someone else looking at you with a trained eye. It's really actually a relatively small amount of time needed to apply the principles that I just listed in sharpening the body's biomechanics. It can be part of the warm-up and or cool down routine, and it doesn't need to take a whole lot of time, but we do want to make sure our range of motion in all our joints, particularly hips, are strong and good, but also again, that stability and balance. And so there's routines I put up, and there's any number of ways these drills and exercises can be combined or where they get placed in a training period, whether it's part of the running workout or if it's connected to like a weight training workout or whatever it is, there's lots of room for variance. These are just some ways I've organized it as a starting point. And all these categories from the pre-run warm-up, kind of loosening up after maybe a day's sitting in an uncomfortable chair, general drills to just sharpen form, core exercises for our breathing and posture, other drills that may be more targeted towards your specific needs, and then just stretching, how all those things fit together. There's a lot of variance based on your history, your vulnerabilities, your training goals. But I think attending to them in some form is important to have that holistic preparedness. Transitioning to talk more about the training side, I love this quote just in that the sport of distance running is, in a way, less about speed in terms of our barrier. It's the endurance side. So a lot of training fundamentally is about improving the endurance side because our speed is often there at some level based on our physiology, muscle fiber biology, and things like that. It's the how long can you hold that speed? That's the training aspect. How to improve endurance and speed is the key for designing a training plan. We have to balance a number of things because if it's too easy, there's too little effort, too little demand being placed, your body is not going to adapt, especially for something as taxing as a half marathon or certainly a marathon. But also, if there's too much intensity, especially as it has to do with timing of when and how much, then the body's going to crash either from energy depletion or an injury issue. There is an art and a science, and there's a lot of room for subjectivity in that. And it's defined principally first by defining what's the race distance you're training for, but then fundamentally what is your goal, and everyone's going to have a little bit slightly different goal. It might just be to finish the race, and that then influences how I as a coach would help guide thinking about training. But if it's a personal best, that changes the framework considerably because then there needs to be even more emphasis in a way on pushing towards limits in different physiological systems. Whereas in just finishing, there's the fundamental ability just to run that distance. And that's also a great starting point. I think most people probably should start that way with their first half or marathon. But then if you've caught the bug and want to do more and more and get better, then more and more training needs to be nuanced and get speed work into the equation. But regardless of your skill, your experience, really the foundation adaptation, like the tissue and the mind and the body in general needs to adapt to be able to handle that race. So there was endurance and speed. Endurance is the foundation, fundamentally about how much work, how much time can you tolerate running, basically. And that has to be built up. And that is built principally on just easy runs. What that easy run looks like for you, like what pace is relative, principally being something where you can comfortably talk, your breathing is not being strained. Built up through warm-up runs, cool downs, short runs, moderate, long runs, all of it. That's building your endurance. As a general principle, I do encourage people to think of their long run as about a quarter or maybe up to 30 something percent of their weekly mileage. I've seen some people try to do 50% of their mileage in one run, and that just starts getting very risky because that's a lot of stress on one day relative to the week and their adaptation. That it still kind of depends on running background, but as a general principle, I suggest that's a good measurement. And then even with thinking of a training cycle, there's a lot of variance here too, but to be adequately adapted and prepared for a half marathon, I think someone needs to be able to run up to like 10 miles at least prior to that half. Again, there's lots of variance there, but even with a full, being able to build up to a certain mileage is important just so that the body knows what it feels like a little bit. So it's not such a shock to the system. Thinking about how mileage is built up over time is a really important area to think about. And there's a lot of different ways of doing it where it builds up a little bit and then it goes down and builds up more. I've really found building up every third week to be a really safe method for myself, even. So running the same mileage 2 weeks and then that third week building up by about 10 or 15% relative to the mileage of the previous 2 weeks. That just provides a gentle progression. So that has to be considered in the schedule when looking at a race day and then working back, how many weeks do I have? Eric and I both would recommend people who've never run before, a walk run progression can be a great, safer starting point. And there's a lot of ways even to break that up. So that's for the newcomer, just to, again, allow that time for the tissue to adapt to the stress of running. The key being recovery has to be factored in, it's essential. And that's from week to week thinking about recovery. Where does your recovery fit in the 7 days a week? But even from day to day, or even within a workout itself, how is the recovery factoring into that workout so that things are not being overstressed? Most people who have run before have experienced muscle soreness. Typically, it's said to be highest 2 days after the high stress, whether it's a long run or an intense speed workout. It's just being mindful of those things and looking at patterns in your own body, because people do respond to stress differently, and recognizing I feel the most fatigue the next day or 2 days after. So I need to make sure that maybe is accommodated by a recovery oriented workout and not another hard workout. So that 1 to 2 day after a stressful activity, a stressful workout, there has to be attention to that because of greater vulnerability. Other things can be great ways to rest. So it doesn't have to just be no activity, but it's thinking strategically about making sure the key areas are recovering so that they can adapt, because it's in that recovery that the tissue is growing stronger. And if it doesn't get to recovery, it will just eventually snap. So the other main factor, speed, again, how the training is designed really depends on your goals, but also your running history. Nonlinear periodization is just something I think of as trying to incorporate little elements of speed, like fartleks, strides, little hill sprints, or just hill training in general, like hilly terrain, amidst the running. So it doesn't just need to begin with pure, simple, easy running for weeks, and then it starts including some speed. That is a way to do it. That'd be a linear periodization. But I have found, and there's research that backs up, the nonlinear being a safer and ultimately more advantageous way. So it can be small little ways of including speed, even in the easy base training period, but having just that little bit of touch points with speed, introductions, the body is then in a very gentle way allowed to kind of adapt and be prepared for when you want to really get into more speed workouts, maybe mid training cycle. Another important aspect to think about with training and planning your whole training cycle is, what is the course I'm going to be running on? Is it fully flat? Is it a rolling course? Does it have a lot of downs, ups? The more specific we train to our race, essentially, the better. So for a Boston, for example, I knew it was very hilly, so needed a lot of good hill train, but I knew it wasn't just about hill climbing too. It was about handling the downhill, which is actually often the harder part about Boston. And so training the body to handle and be adapted to the stress of down and up was essential. So mentally and physically preparing for that as much as possible with all the resources in our toolbox. Something I just want to touch point on, a lot of people are using some kind of watch like a Garmin or Apple Watch, or a lot of the apps that are available generally seem to use heart rate as a guide, which is a basic guide because it's one of the easier ways to measure something. I would say that it can also be very misleading because a lot of max heart rates are, determined by a really basic formula that doesn't really give the full picture. So someone based on the formula maybe said, oh, I have 180 is my max heart rate based on the formula, but your max heart rate may be 195 or 200. You only would really know if you got into a sports lab to really test it. Measuring that with an open hand and using also two other factors, perceived effort, how hard does it feel? And that even measured alongside your pace. If you are a veteran runner and have run 5Ks or other races, those are informative. Even if it's your first half marathon, but done 10Ks and 5Ks, those give us a sense as coaches what your speed potential is. Now, you may not be able to run a 5K speed for a half marathon. That's totally normal. But it gives us a sense of what your speed already is. And there are ways of adjusting that to the different types of speed workouts that can be incorporated in training. So PR can be a very valuable guide. And even if you've never run a race before, there's ways to just do little time trials just to check yourself and start using that data to inform training. Sometimes can be frustratingly limiting if you're just focused on heart rate as the determinant of effort. I know I had that even in college sometimes, where it's like I was supposed to stay in a certain zone, and I'm like, this feels so easy. Like, this is easier than the workout is supposed to be, but the heart rate was keeping me there. But I don't think it was reflective of the actual effort, the perceived effort I needed to be doing. And so our heart can handle quite a bit generally. And that's where I think those three factors are important to weigh in together and not maybe just one. So tempo is a term that can be used thinking about pace. Basically, it's synonymous with pace, but it's basically a combination of power. How much ground can you cover with each stride and how long can you sustain that? And so that's what speed training is about, is improving and sharpening that tempo, how long you can sustain running at your goal pace. And power it can be developed slightly through running, particularly hill running, but a lot of that actually is sharpened through things like weightlifting, biking, other forms of exercise that are great supplements, which then also have the benefit of not stressing your legs like running. And so working together, that creates a more holistic, successful program. Threshold, VO2 max, and repetitions. Those are three categories of workouts I like to think about. There are different paces based on different goals of how you're training your lactic acid threshold. Lactic acid's that lead feeling in your legs when you're not getting enough oxygen anymore. And so there's a threshold we all have, and that can be trained to be delayed. And then the heart power and just the system's ability to circulate blood and transfer energy, all these different workout styles can train those different things and overlap, but they're essential for really developing the body's ability to run at a faster pace. That's like very much an overview. There's a lot of specifics you get into based on an individual's data, but those are things to think about if you want to really get to the next level. This is a really basic template, but based on experience, study, as I alluded to with peak mileage, where I thought people needed to be able to run up to feel at least strong running that distance, I would suggest for someone running a half marathon that 12 to 14 weeks is a pretty good range. It can be more, but I think when you start getting less, depending on your base mileage or your history of fitness, if someone was starting from zero, I might actually recommend it be longer. Again, it depends on a lot of variables. It can absolutely be done in less. I've worked with athletes who come off injury and had 5 weeks to train for half, in which they changed their goal to be finishing, not racing a personal best. But I think at least for personal best or feeling really strong and aggressive on race day, something around this line is a good framework. Again, where at least peak conditioning gets to something like 25 miles at least per week, and the long run gets to up to 10 miles. I think that would just feel the most safe to be ready for that half marathon. And similarly, with a full marathon, definitely want longer just to be able to safely build. The key is, again, we don't want to rush the building of mileage because that's where injuries often happen. And so allowing that time also just for both of these, sometimes we get sick or sometimes something happens that kind of throws a wrench in our plans, and we need some room to adjust and not feel so constrained by the mileage plan. The mileage plan is a guide, it's not set in stone. We need room for adjustment in that. With clients, I'm usually giving them training plans a 1 to 2 week basis because I want to leave space for both of us to adapt it. I have a mapped out plan. Some athletes get married to the mileage too strictly and then they get hurt because they're so unwilling to change it. And we want to be willing to adjust, but we need time. We need time to build up that base, depending again on what base you're coming from pre-training cycle. I think to be able to run that 20+ mile long run in anticipation for a marathon, you need to build up to at least 45 miles. I mean, that's pushing it a bit because that's getting towards that like 40% of your weekly mileage. It can definitely be done, but at least that. I think if it's less, that's just a lot demand in one run on the body. And then, as I maybe mentioned, cross training, biking, swimming, those are great tools in our arsenal to mix up training to make it more interesting, but also to develop power, to rest the legs, because biking can be working the legs while also resting them at the same time because it's just not impacting the legs the same way running is. And whether it's actual swimming or aqua jogging, great for the lungs, really gentle on the limbs. And so those can be great tools to factor in or just have in reserve in case little pain areas flare up and or options are limited for running, especially like in the winter. Thinking about race week, race day, people hear about tapering and it's kind of an interesting art and science. But just to highlight the concept, you start lowering your volume while keeping the intensity high. So maybe my peak week is 65 miles and I have a couple workouts at a certain pace. I start tapering, I go down to 50, 55 miles and then 45. But my speed and the dynamic of what I'm doing in that is staying the same. It's just the lowered volume of mileage, the lowered time out on my feet is actually allowing then more rest and hopefully freshness come the starting line. Some say you can do it 3 weeks. I think 3 weeks starts pushing it where you feel almost like you're deconditioning or like out of it. But the key is just keeping sharp with the intensity staying the same, just lower volume. Carb loading is also one of those things. It's like an art and science, very relative to the individual. But the principle, again, similarly, is like assuming you've been, especially for marathon running, you've been building up a hearty nutritional intake, probably more calories than usual. And so maybe in that tapering or that final week, as mileage is going down, you're still eating the same as when you were at peak mileage before. The theory about that is that it's then you have like an extra reserve of energy. So it's not about doing like what Michael Scott does in The Office, where he's chugging a bunch of Alfredo right before the race. That's definitely a bad idea. Or even maybe the night before. It's keeping the foods that you're used to, but it's making sure the quantity is still high in anticipation, especially again, of marathons. I think it's slightly less critical for halves, but it's also very subjective to your digestive system, your eating habits. But that's the principle of it, something to experiment with. The theory is that it's created a reserve of energy because you've taken in a certain amount that the body is used to taking in and is hungry for, but you haven't burned it all off because you've done less mileage. The key thing, though, really being routine, consistency, whatever that looks like for you. And that is going to be related to also sleep. Sleep is probably the most important in a way. Nutrition, hydration, consistent throughout the training cycle, but definitely on race week. Race week's not a time to try something different. It's the time to just keep up the same patterns you've been doing that you know work for you and your digestive system. It's also really important to have trained for that. So if you're using goo or some kind of energy chew or whatever it is, and then also drinking water, train to do that during runs, during the long runs, especially, so that you know what it feels like. You kind of can sharpen your process of what you want it to be like, what tastes good, what sits well, because everyone's completely different. Some brands don't work for some people while they work for others. There's just a lot of variety. So you want to test it not on race day, but on the training building up so that you have a feel for it. And it's also just going to be important for when you're getting into those longer and longer runs, you're going to need the energy throughout. So making sure you're taking care of your body in that way is important. And then just thinking about your schedule, again, consistency is ideal. And especially at least in the final weeks, adapting your running schedule, like your long runs, to be the day and maybe even time range of the race. So a lot of races are Sunday mornings. Put your long run in that time so your body is kind of getting used to that schedule, because our bodies are very adaptive and they sense and they kind of prepare without us being conscious of it for those demands. And so if you've trained it to be used to having a long run Sunday morning and you get to race day, it's gonna be like, this is normal. This is what we're ready for. We've trained for this. And finally, just especially for some going for personal bests, considering pacing, the first miles can be essential, or the first half of a race, and recognizing that adrenaline's a major factor for you and everyone around you sometimes. And that can make it great because you actually can go faster and you don't feel like you're going faster because you got this adrenaline pumping. But it's also a reason and hopefully built on the pacing that's been established in training. If you've done speed work in training, not only is it supposed to be training your body to handle it, it's also training you to recognize what feels like the right pace. I mean, we often can use watches and mile splits, and that helps reinforce, am I going the right pace? But also just learning to trust, does this feel like I'm straining myself? Because if it is, it's probably going too fast, especially in the beginning when the adrenaline is also pumping. Because once that adrenaline's gone, then it's going to really hit. You just can't afford, especially in the long distances, to go out way too aggressively, because then it's going to be a big struggle to recover breathing and just the body's system. So setting ourselves up for success is basically the idea of pacing. Just a couple of things to highlight at the end that I've mentioned throughout that are really essential in the mix of training and preparing. Also, nutrition, even thinking about flexibility or really range of motion and what does that look like. Done talks on these so you can look at them in depth in those recap videos. Even just thinking how you prepare yourself mentally for racing is a huge part, especially when you've got 2+ hours to be by yourself, essentially, or in a crowd in your head. The mind is a big part of that. And in fact, some would might say it's more than 50% of the results are defined by our will and our sort of resilience. Our goal is just to equip you and educate you as best as possible to have all the pieces to think about. There's a lot of subjectivity in terms of how you put those pieces together and what those pieces look like once they're put together. But hopefully this is giving you either affirmation of what you already know or bringing up some new points to think about for successful running.
My name is Eric, and I am a physical therapist. I'm actually not a runner. I didn't grow up running. I grew up swimming and playing water polo, but as the years have gone by, I've adjusted to enjoying the runs. And I'd like to share some of the knowledge I've had over the years working with runners. So we time this close to the new year because most people that we see have resolutions, whether weight loss, diet, stuff like that. And one key component to that is running because it's pretty easy to do, and then people get motivated to get back on track. A lot of my patients I see actually, they'll start coming in saying, "Hey, I registered for a marathon and I hurt myself. Any advice?" And usually the injury comes about a month after training. Typically speaking, a training error is felt about a month after you start training because it takes time to build up the micro trauma and then you start to experience the aches and pains. So the error was a month prior, but if you're starting to feel pain now, you kind of have to look back and like, oh, what happened? So as a general theme, beginning runners have a higher risk of injury for a variety of reasons, but mostly to inexperience and understanding how to pace yourself, a good running schedule, how to recover, issues related to that. And that's why a coach like Josh are wonderful to guide you along in this process. The number one injury I see is a runner's knee. But again, we see Achilles issues, IT band syndrome, low back pain. And as I stated, injury usually comes 3 weeks after training. Absent some traumatic injury, if you start to feel the aches and pains, you have to really consider your training program. Training errors are usually just being too vigorous without great recovery. So going too hard, too fast, too soon. Or in other words, pushing the tissue's ability to repair itself. So I have a few tips in my talk. Number one is gradually increase your load. Josh alluded to, every week or so increase about, it depends on individual, but small increments in volume or intensity to your program. And this is the most common issue I see in my runners. A lot of runners come in wanting to change their shoes, and that's usually not the problem. It's their training program. So I would look first and foremost, how are you training yourself? And then maybe running form, and then also your strengthening routine, which I will get to later. Josh did spend time with this, and this is just general idea. Recovery runs are really essential to your development for endurance training and reducing the risk of injury. Getting that foundation on your joints, on your bones, and on your muscles just build up its tolerance to endure. Fatigue is huge. Listening to your body. So the body is telling you if you're feeling, hey, not motivated to run, if you feel sluggish, you're getting persistent aches and pains, it's a warning sign of something's a little amiss. My hope is, or in probably most running coaches, you feel good running, like you feel motivated, that you have the energy to go for that daily run. But if these features start to interfere with your running, you might want to take a step back, what's going on with your training program, and get some guidance that way. So I've seen this a lot in my runners that I work with is I tell them about the program, and a lot of them, again, going too hard, too soon, too fast. And they're so stuck on the program that they ignore the warning signs to the point of their own detriment. So effects of fatigue, two studies about fatigue. One is that they compared runners, old and young, but essentially they're saying, hey, let's kind of run these runners until they're tired and let's just see how the body changes. And they want to see what does the body do under fatigue. And they found some biomechanical changes when you get tired. This in particular study noticed that there's increased knee bending or flexion. And what that equates to, it's more pressure on the knee and ankle and those passive structures. They also notice increased tibial internal rotation or when your knees cave in. And that puts a lot of stress and strain on the knee. And that's potentially indicative of a weaker hip not being able to control that rotation. Again, it's more to it than just that. But that's what the study found. And it said, hey, that might correlate to increased injury because biomechanics get a little affected. This was an interesting study, kind of getting more of the psychological elements of how runners cope with running and fatigue. My personal experience with runners is they don't like to stop, especially when they have a race coming up. They love to hit those miles. And I understand you training all this time and you don't want to stop your runs. But what I see with a lot of these runners is they just run themselves on the ground. They get overloaded, they get stressed, mentally fatigued. And I know it's very hard to take a step back, but if you get some time to recover, you're going to feel much better. But I know psychologically it's hard to do. So the study kind of looked at that type of population and they called it harmonious versus obsessive passion. Passion being like your identity with running. And people that were more harmonious, hey, I have an injury or I feel aches and pains, let me take some time off. They tended to cope better with injury as opposed to more obsessive psychological type, meaning like I have to run. This is my identity. I'll get depressed if I don't run. And that obsessive passion led runners, that personality type, to have more susceptible to injuries. And that makes sense. You're just wearing yourself thin until you can't take it anymore. So just kind of take analysis of yourself. Like, who am I? Do I listen to my body? Am I more harmonious or obsessive? So tip number 2 is listen to your body. If you're feeling fatigued, if you lack motivation, or your body doesn't feel fully recovered, listen to it. Another issue I see with runners is a lack of strengthening exercises. I know runners love running, but strengthening is a huge component to resilience in your tissue. And it not only improves the resilience, but performance, decrease injury risk, and improve shock attenuation. It's protective. And not just muscles, putting a load stimulus on the tendons, which connect muscle to bone, and the ligaments, which attach bone to bone, helps reduce the risk of issues with all those structures if done right. So this is just a general schematic graph of injury risk and load capacity. If you're untrained, like the new runner, or not have a great strengthening program, your load capacity or the tissue's ability to withstand the force is lower. So hypothetically, at a mile, you might be in a risk of injury because the tissue's resilience is not great. But more for the trained athlete, if you're adapting those structures appropriately, putting a load on them, strengthening and training well, your load capacity for that tissue increases. So the risk of injury is much lower. My top 5 exercises I give runners, and this is, again, everyone's different, just like the training program. Number 1 is a Bulgarian split squat. It loads the knee up front, so that's very protective for patellofemoral issues or runner's knee. Patellar tendonitis. Of course, it's improved strength in the hip and quad. It's just one of my favorite exercises for the runner. You can add a weight to make it more load intensive. And I usually say go controlled, slow down, slow up. So it's tension over time. Granted, you can add more power to it with more speed, but at least in the beginning, control it. Number 2 is the double leg glute bridge with a band. This improves the hip strength of the glutes. That helps prevent the knee from caving in, but it's also, again, very protective for many issues. IT band syndrome is one. IT band is very much connected to the lateral hip, the hip abductor. And when that's weak or just fatigued, the knee tends to cave in. So strengthening that muscle is huge for protection. And the glutes really help offset, even you could say plantar fasciitis. If your knees cave in, your foot caves in, and that puts more tension on the plantar fascia. Single leg calf raises, a very straightforward exercise. I like doing it with a step usually, but we see a lot of Achilles issues, calf strains or Achilles tendonitis or osis. So single leg calf raises are wonderful. Again, adding load to it with weight is a wonderful remedy to increase the loading capacity. If the calf is weak, it creates more knee flexion or the knee bending. Part of the role for the calf is to prevent so much knee flexion. So if the calf is fatigued, you get more knee flexion, and that could put more stress on the patella or the IT band even. I put this one in there because many of us sit for work, and the muscles on the hip adaptively shorten the hip flexor. It helps not only improve stride length, but puts less pressure on the back. And again, you can make an argument if the hip flexor is tight, it compensates the gait a little bit, so you can put more pressure on the inside of the knee and the foot. Given the commonplace of this impairment, this is a wonderful stretch to do. And side steps. This is back to that hip abductor that is very protective for the IT band syndrome. So you're going back and forth with a band around your, I have it here for my feet. You can do around your ankles or legs. Great exercise for that outside hip. There are many exercises I do with my runners, but the top 5 I just share with you are the ones that, if you had no injury, that I highly recommend to my runners. We do have a strength assessment. So just referencing our website, we have a free reference for how to assess your glutes, how to assess your hips, quads, and how to progress to see where you're at to hopefully prevent injury and understanding how to strengthen these specific structures. So the last tip here is really got to focus on strengthening and loading your legs to complement your training program.
I guess we'd start looking at the training plan, what it incorporates, but it can be so many factors. And sometimes your training can go really well and you still sometimes hit a wall, which is then a mystery sometimes to assess. Like, usually there's something we can figure out, whether it's sleep, extra stress, something nutritional during, before. Even veterans make mistakes, or just our bodies do things that are rebellious, and we have to do all we can to try to temper it. And sometimes that's where just grit is important and experience. Some training plans may have one 20-mile run and that's it in a shorter time frame. I have found personally, actually, well, that's a good minimum to be more adapted to that latter part of the race of a marathon. Having a couple weeks at a higher mileage can really pay off. It's also the nature of what those long runs are in the tapering. So I might taper down, peak at 20 or 22 to like a 16, and then like a half marathon the week before, just because I want my body to feel that similar like cycle and all the strains, etc. So bonking, yeah, there's a lot of variables to think about it. Maybe it needs more time running at that volume. Maybe it's nutritional, maybe it's stress, maybe it's sleep, maybe it's the race conditions were affecting you because maybe you're getting into a very cold or hot, or the terrain is harder than expected. There's so many variables, but it'd be a conversation of let's think about all the variables and try to start narrowing in on what it could have been.
Depends on the soreness. I don't want pain to go above 3 out of 10 on the pain scale, and I don't want it to linger or there the next day. Feeling kind of achy or sore or it's unusual, it's your body's way of telling you that you maybe need a little more recovery time.
If it's soreness and fatigue that's lingering more than a couple of days, there's reason to pay attention and probably back off and let your body recover. And it can be active. It can be as simple as running short, really easy runs, flat runs. It can be also rehab measures in the mix, like adding some good rolling, icing, taking some ibuprofen or something to help with just the symptoms, and making sure definitely there's a lot of sleep and nutritional restoration from food and protein particularly, and hydration. So there's a lot of things to do to help the recovery process. Sometimes we run it, it's not about the distance, it's the effort we ran them. So I could run a distance that I'm completely adapted to, but I ran it much harder or the terrain was much more intense and I'm going to feel it for a bit longer. So I just need to be careful in the recovery. And that's what I would advise to others. Yes, if you have not realized the value of biking amidst running training, I cannot emphasize enough. There's too many athletes I've gotten to championship races even who have had injury issues through biking, keeping them in it. It keeps you psychologically engaged, it keeps your muscles working. It's not aerobically the same as running, but it's like when your options are limited, the biking can get you there and get you there ready as possible. Even for each of us, even who've done many halves or fulls, sometimes that post-race recovery can be different from race to race or year to year. Like, it's not a constant. The same thing is true with training. Like, a training plan that worked for you last year may not work exactly the same this year, and we have to have that in consideration. But even with recovery, some well-earned laziness sometimes is just needed. Befriend the couch, put the legs up. It can be so different in terms of the needs. So listening to your body, adjusting based on what it's telling you is so important, because some post races you're like, I felt great, I'm just gonna keep running a bit, awesome. But sometimes you're like, no, my legs are dead, like I need to rest, and that's also important too.
So the idea behind an ice bath is if you beat yourself up, it helps, with the pain process and inflammation and recovery. So to say to the point, if it's faster recovery, it depends.
I love an ice bath after like a marathon. It just feels great because it is numbing. And there, I mean, Eric's talked in previous workshops about the nature of like the physiology that's changing with ice and heat impact, the how the blood's vessels are dilating, etc. So there's definitely science behind it helping recovery with inflammation and blood flow, etc. An ice bath is more thorough because it's just all encompassed versus an ice bag. But yeah, again, I haven't seen any research that says it's faster per se. It's a great tool for recovery. Absolutely.
if you can't see the pattern, if it's not due to some maybe training, the lack thereof, or overtraining or whatever, nutritionally speaking, or genetics would be something else I'll be looking at. I understand the stimulus too. When you put pressure on a muscle, it could affect the fibers and the orientation of a pathway to the brain that kind of helps relax it. Like massage is relaxing when you have pressure to that. Maybe like acupuncture, for example, it's a pressure points that go into and it helps relax the nervous system. And so you can also think about maybe something with the nervous system, hyperactivity or something as well, because I like to see patterns of what brings it on, what doesn't. If it's not, it might be something more systemic. Manifestation of, for example, stress or anxiety could have some implications to muscle tone.
My first thought would be making sure you're hydrated well, but also that your electrolyte level is good. Electrolytes being like salts and other things, which you can get through energy chews and drinks, but also it's looking at your general nutrition. But that can be a common route to cramping is dehydration, not enough electrolytes, and or just not enough oxygen that's coming through, or something's being overworked in a certain way that's then causing it to flip out, basically. So those are the first four things I would think of and look at. And then maybe start looking at mechanics too to see if that would be a factor. But the first things would be what you're putting in to help with just the systems.
Kind of touch on that too. I do have a lot of runners that come and say, "Hey, I'm hydrating, I'm doing everything great," and I get these kind of tightness in the calf, and so I keep stretching, but the tightness doesn't go away. And what I found is actually a symptom of weakness or load intolerance, because the calves are getting kind of pissed off, maybe spasming out a little bit. So ironically enough, they're feeling tight, and so I say, "Well, let's strengthen it," and they feel better over time.